Okay, in this video we're going to be adding a multitude of new weapons to the game. Now, in the previous video we went into the character and we set up a first person character to have a gun, like so. However, we're actually going to get rid of this gun, so I really just wanted to show you how to do attaching, and we're going to do it a different way. Because we want a bunch of different guns, the standard way that you would do it is you would create a new blueprint for each type of gun. So for example, if you wanted an AK-47, you might make a blueprint for that, and then you might make another blueprint for the M16. And since the AK-47 and the M16 are very similar, and the only thing that would be different is the amount of damage they do, and maybe what the gun looks like, you would create a parent blueprint that both the AK-47 and the M16 guns would derive from. So I know that might be a little bit confusing, but whenever you have blueprints that are incredibly similar, you can make a parent class, and then the blueprints can derive, we call it, from the parent class. And by doing this, it just saves us from writing the exact same blueprint code twice, if that makes sense. Imagine you had 100 guns in your game. You wouldn't want to write the same code to shoot the gun 100 times over. You just write it once in the parent class, and then your other guns will use that parent class. So what we're going to do is, I really want to stress to keep stuff organized because it can get really messy. We'll click on the content folder, right click and go new folder, and then I'm going to type blueprints, and we're going to put most of our blueprints in here. Let's make another folder inside of here called weapons. And then we'll right click and make a blueprint class. And what we're going to make is our special master class. So you remember our character is a blueprint. And we're just doing the exact same thing. We're just creating a blueprint. It's the exact same as our character. This time though, we're creating a blueprint for all of the weapons in the game. Now currently the weapons that the player holds are components, but we're actually going to make the weapons be their own standalone actors. And we're doing that for good reason, because if you want multiple guns in your game, it's much easier to handle them as separate blueprints. And over the next few videos, you'll kind of come to see why it's easier. For now, we're going to go back into weapons and we're going to right click, blueprint class. Now there are tons of different parents that we can use, and depending on which thing we pick, we can do all sorts of different stuff. And there's good descriptions here. For example, if I wanted to make a character, I would click on character. If I wanted to make a new game mode, I would click on game mode base, and so on. But because we don't need any sort of special behavior going on, we can just use actor. Actor is basically the most plain class you can derive from, with the exception of one other one, but I won't talk about that. Actor is really as simple as it gets. It is an object that can be placed in the world. And sure enough, our gun can be placed in the world. You remember, we talked about an actor just being anything in the level, and actors can have components. So I'm going to click on actor, and you remember how I said I'm going to make a weapon base class, and then I'm going to have an AK-47 and an M16, and they're all going to derive from the base class. Well, what we're making here is the base class, and I'm just going to call it BP_weapon. And it needs two things. It needs a third-person gun and a first-person gun. So it's the exact same as we did before. So we're going to add a component, skeletal mesh. And we don't need this one. By default, it comes with a component, but we really don't want that. So just drag the skeletal mesh and drop it on top of here and let go. I'm going to call this first-person gun. And then we'll add one more component, another skeletal mesh, and I'm going to call this one third person gun. Because remember, there's two different guns. There's one that we can see from the first person, and then there's one that everyone else sees. Now, like I said, we have our parent gun class, and then all of the other guns in the game are going to derive from that class, so that we don't have to write the same code 100 times over. We just write it once, and then we just make some small changes for each of the guns. Because of this though, we need to think about what each gun will need, because well, we need to think about things that all the guns will have in common. So for example, all guns are going to have a name. All guns are going to have an amount of damage that they do. And we want to be able to change that for each of the guns, right? We might want the M16 to do twice as much damage as the AK-47 or something like that. So to do that, we need to add something called a variable. And a variable sounds confusing, but it's really just a value that is stored and can be changed. We're going to add variable, and I'm going to type damage. Now there are a bunch of different types of information that we can store. If I click here, we can store an integer, which is a number. We can store a name of something. We can store some text. We can store a vector, which would be a position. We can store a rotation. There are a ton of things that we can store, but the amount of damage is going to be a number. So we could select integer, which would be a number. So you might have 50 damage or 20 damage or 30 damage. But because I want to have decimal places, I'm going to select float. That just means a number, but it has decimals in it. So I'm going to click on float and then hit compile and save. In here, there's the default value. This is the default value for how much damage a gun will do by default. So we can change the gun's damage to make it do more or less damage. But by default, let's say that all guns, before we change anything, do 30 damage. So just type in 30 and press enter. And so now by default, any gun is going to do 30 damage. Now, keep in mind, we're not doing anything with this yet. We've just made a variable that stores the damage. We'll use the damage later to calculate, you know, health amounts and different things like that. But for now, we're just making this value, and it's set to 30 right now. And we can change it later on if we want. So our parent weapon class is not really finished. We've just made a variable and added a couple of components. It's certainly not ready to be used. We can't shoot the weapon or anything like that yet. But I just want to show you how to create the blueprints that derive from our master class. So remember, this is the master class. To derive from it, you just right click and then you select create child. So I'm going to call this one BP underscore assault rifle. And then I'm going to make another child, and I'll call this one BP underscore scoped rifle. And we'll open these up. So for the assault rifle, I'm going to click on first person gun. I'm going to select the skeletal mesh to be the assault rifle. And I need to do the same for the third person gun as well. Otherwise nothing will show up for other players in the game. So I need to select that. And now I'm going to do the scoped rifle. So it's the exact same process. You can actually select them both and do it at one time if you want. So we're going to select sniper rifle, and there we go. So now we have our sniper and our assault rifle. And what we can do is we can drag these into the level. So if I drag the scoped rifle into the game, you can see it appears in the game. Now it doesn't do anything. It's just a mesh right now. But we're going to add the ability to equip these in just a second. One more thing that we want is we want our weapon to have a name, right? So let's make another variable, and let's call this weapon name. Now I'm going to select text and not name. Name's something else, and I'll explain what name does at a later time. But for now, I'm going to select text, and that's because whenever you want to display something to the player, always use text. And later on, we're going to be telling the player what weapon they have equipped. So weapon name. And we can give it a default name. So I'm just going to call mine weapon. So if you forget to assign a name to a weapon, it's just called weapon by default. Now, a really cool thing we can do here is if we click on this little bit here, we can edit some of the properties and check it out. These are the default properties, damage and weapon name. So because this is the scoped rifle, I'm going to give it the weapon name, scoped rifle. And I'm going to set the damage amount for the scoped rifle to be 100. Let's say that the scoped rifle is a one-hit kill. And then let's say that the assault rifle, if I click on this bit and go to the details panel, let's say that the assault rifle does 45 damage by default. And the weapon name is assault rifle. And now we have 2 weapons and we've set all the values up for them. Now, this part's kind of sad, but we need to delete our hard work. We're going to click on the first person gun and delete it. We can also delete this sphere. We don't need this anymore. And we're also going to delete the third person gun. So now the player does not have a gun. That's okay. We're going to add that back in a second, but we need to delete this for now since we're using our new special blueprint guns that we've created. For now, click on these errors and just get rid of some of these errors. So for the firing, we're going to redo the firing as well in a little bit. So I'm just going to delete some of this stuff here. In fact, for now, we can just delete all of the firing logic. We'll add that back in later on, because we're going to do our own firing anyway. And if we go into the construction script, we need to get rid of all of the stuff that we did before, because we're no longer using it. And now you should compile just fine. Now, I said that a variable is something that can change, and we can store numbers, we can store text, all sorts of things. Well, one thing we need to store in a variable is what weapon the player is currently holding. And that way, because we've stored the weapon in a variable, we can say give the player some ammo, or we can delete the weapon, or so on. We need a way of tracking it, and we use a variable to do this as well. So I'm going to call this weapon. And I'm going to type weapon in here and select BP weapon. So this is the player's current weapon. And I know that might be a little bit confusing, but it's what we need to do. Now, unfortunately, another thing is there's replication. Replication is required because by default, other players aren't going to see what weapon we have equipped. So we need to replicate it so that other players know what weapon we have. So that's really important when you're building a networks game. Make sure that you replicate it. We're actually going to select the second one called rep notify. What that does is it's going to replicate it to other players, but it will also allow us to do some special stuff when it replicates, and we need to do that. We need to say, when you get a new weapon, replicate it to other people. So rep notify. And you'll see how this works in a second. We're going to do the exact same thing that we did in the last video with this construction script. We're just doing it in here instead. So let's go to the event graph. I want to talk about the event graph because we have to talk about it at some point before we move on. So in the event graph, you have these things called events. And events are exactly what they sound like. They're just events. They're things that have happened. And you can respond to events in different ways. So, for example, here we have the event jump pressed. So when I press jump, make the character jump. So respond to the jump event by jumping. So that's kind of what an event is. We're going to make an event called add weapon, so that when we pick up a weapon, we can add it to the player. So right click and type custom event and add a custom event and call it give weapon. This is like a special event we're making now. So whenever we want to give our player a weapon, we can use this event that we're making to give the player a weapon. We're going to click new parameter, and the parameter is going to be the weapon that we're giving to our player. Because what weapon are we giving to the player? We need to know what the weapon is. So as a parameter, we're going to type weapon, and we want to be able to select a weapon blueprint. So type in weapon. Object refers to a weapon that's in the game, but we don't want that. We want one of our weapon blueprints. So you need to click on class reference to be able to select a weapon blueprint. What we want to do is take that weapon blueprint and spawn the weapon into the game and then give it to the player, right? So to do that, we need to use something called spawn actor. So when we want to give our player a weapon, we can respond to that event by spawning an actor. And the actor to spawn is whatever weapon we've chosen. Now, one problem is that the spawn actor node needs to know where to spawn the weapon. We can just spawn it at the location of our character actor. So wherever our character is in the world, just spawn it where our character is, because we're going to give it to the character, so we may as well spawn it there. So to do that, we're going to type get actor transform. And because we're inside of the character blueprint, that's saying get the location of wherever this character is in the level, and then spawn the weapon there. We can also set ourselves as the owner, so type self, and set ourselves as the owner and instigator. Owner is just a networking thing. We need to know who owns the weapon. And once you've spawned the actor, we want to store the weapon in this weapon variable that we've made. To store a value in a variable, hold Alt and drag the variable in and drop it. And now you can see it's setting the variable. And because we've selected the special with notify, it's going to allow us to do some special stuff in here once we've spawned the weapon. And the particular thing we want to do is we want to attach the weapon to the player. So to attach the weapon to the player, we're going to open onRep weapon, and the weapon has now been set. Now, if we lose our weapon, onRep weapon will also be called regardless. OnRep weapon gets called when our weapon changes, and that includes when we lose our weapon. So we want to make sure that we've picked up a weapon and not dropped a weapon. And we can do that by typing is valid and then clicking this one with the question mark. That means check if the weapon exists. If the weapon does exist, we can get the third person gun and attach that to our character's mesh. So just like we did in the construction script earlier on, it's the exact same thing we did just in the last video. We're going to hold control, drag the mesh in, and we need to do that thing where we go attach to component, and we're going to type grip point, and we want to snap it into the player's hand. So make sure that you select all these to be snap to target, and then plug that in. And we just need to do the same thing for the first person gun as well. Hold control, drag weapon in, and get the first person gun. So now our first person gun component and our third person gun component are no longer a component in our character. They're a component in this completely separate blueprint, the weapon blueprint. So we want to put the first person gun in the first person arms. We'll drag off here and attach the first person gun to a component. You want the second one. And we're going to plug this in and just copy all these values. Now let's make it so that when the game starts, let's give our player the assault rifle. To find out when the game starts, there's an event called begin play. So you remember I say events are things that you can respond to. Well, there is an event that allows you to respond to something happening at the start of the game. So when you want something to happen when our player spawns into the game, you can simply respond to the event begin play. So right click and type in begin play, and then simply drag out, and we've made our own event called set weapon. Oh, I believe it was called give weapon. So let's drag out and type give weapon. And you can see, just like I said before, what weapon do we want to spawn in? Well, now when we give the weapon to the player, we can select what weapon we want to give to them. Do we want to give them the scoped rifle or the assault rifle? I'm going to select the assault rifle. Now when we hit play, you can see my character has the assault rifle. One issue is that other players can clearly see the wrong gun as well. We can fix that by opening up BP weapon, going to the third person gun and typing owner no C, and then for the first person gun, only owner C. Let's go ahead and save and just try that again. Cool. So all fixed, and now the guns are working. You can see they're not really sitting in our hands properly, and at some point we will correct that, but I figure that's enough work for this video because that's a lot to take in. So I'd recommend going away and even just doing a little bit of study on blueprint classes and how they work, because we did quite a lot in this video. We made our parent master class for the weapon, and then we made 2 other weapons that derive from our master class. And then what we did is we made our own event that we can use to give a weapon to the player. So whenever we want to give a weapon to our player, we can now use this event to do it. And it's perfect. When the player picks up a weapon, we can just use this. Or if we want to implement a cheat code where you type in a cheat and then it gives you a weapon, we can use this. Whenever we need to give a weapon, we now have the means to do so. So what that does is it uses spawn actor to spawn in one of our blueprints, and then it sets the weapon, and when that happens, then this special on-rep weapon thing happens. So it is a lot to take in, but at that point, finally, we then attach the newly spawned weapon to our player, and that's the whole process. So I would recommend watching over this video even a couple times if you need to. But as long as you understand that we have our master class, and then these 2 are children of the master class, and we have variables, and when we open up the children, we can give it names and we can assign damage and things like that. So as long as you really can just grasp those concepts, you should be okay moving forward. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next lesson.